Welcome to The State of Us.
Beyond mainstream cable news and party lines, with a millennial and a boomer, The State of Us pushes past the noise and uncovers all the issues that matter.
Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
How is the presidential transition supposed to work? Well, it's a great question, and in the age of fake news and a lot of the all the information flowing around out there, right? It can be hard to know. It can be hard to know, and this is important. You're going to need to pay attention, because when you're out there and you're talking to people and this is how it's supposed to go and that's how it's supposed to go, and, you know, oh, the president should X, Y, Z, or oh, Biden should X, Y, Z, right? Yada, yada, yada. And nobody or very few people really seem to know the definitive answer, and that's what we're doing today. How should a presidential transition work? And we're talking about the law, right? Not the ambiguous portions, not the esoteric, nothing. Just what does the law say about how this should work? And then we're going to look at, in the next segment, does it need to change? In other words, the last time that we updated this was like 1963, folks. Do we need to update it for modern times? And last but certainly not least, the reality of fact checking. What's going on there? Because again, as we're talking about this, part of why people are confused, misinformation. We've got a lot to discuss, but of course, we couldn't begin this conversation without
TrueChat senior historian and an educator of more than 30 years. Here is your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
Well, many people are full of trepidation as we talk about this, and that is the word of the day, trepidation, Trepidation. It is a noun that means tremulous or trembling movement, quaking or tremor, fearful, uncertainty, anxiety, apprehension. So I think that goes really well as a word of the day with our topic today. People are full of trepidation when it comes to discussing this, because most of us, if we ever read about this, it was back in high school during our civics class. And that was a long time ago, and we probably weren't paying attention. We probably had lunch on our mind, or were thinking about that fun Friday night that we had coming up, and we didn't pay any attention to the electoral college or how it works or the transition of power. So I think it's a very important thing to do, because you do have a lot of information coming at you from different directions. And Justin, you mentioned 1963, but I will bring up 1933 when we created January 20th as the day, because before 1933, which was in the middle of the Great Depression, the changing of power as the banks were folding, Congress said, you know what? We shouldn't be waiting till March or April as we've done in the past. We're going to move it up to January 20th. Is there a need to look at that? And now with technology and travel even better than it was in the 1930s, is it now time maybe to move this whole process and make it a little faster, so that in a tough time and the people voting for a new leader, that new leader takes over in a faster, more convenient time period?
I would be trepidatious about letting our listeners be led to believe that we are saying it has to be changed, but we are saying the question needs to be asked, because as Lance and I are listening, right, as we do to all these different places, the fake news, CNN, fake news, Fox News, right, all these terrible cable, quote unquote, news places, as we listen to those, as we hear the pundits and read the papers, there doesn't seem to be the question being asked, okay, so even if we know what the process is, should it stay this way? And that's what we'll talk about in the second segment. But first, let's understand how is this supposed to work, right? Because there's this whole question of, well, if the winner, quote unquote, isn't certain, okay, so what does that mean? Well, as some of our listeners, I'm sure, remember, back in the year 2000, during that presidential election, they had to deal with this. And there was actually testimony before Congress on December 4th, specifically about the 1963 Presidential Transition Act. And one of the items that's cited in the opening testimony, where this individual, Paul Light, is addressing Congress, he says, "Let me address 6 questions in an effort to clarify the meaning of the words, quote, apparent successful candidates. Why is that important? Well, because in the law, the 1963 Presidential Transition Act, that's what it says. The apparent successful candidates, they receive access to transition assistance, right? Money, resources, all the stuff that's already, by the way, folks, if you didn't know this, early this year, the White House, there's an individual that works at the White House that puts out a directive to all of the departments in any election year. This is how it goes, and says, hey, now is the time prior to when we even get to the election, right, to name who is going to be in charge of transition if there is a transition, right? So they all had to submit, here's who our people are. And so all of that's already figured out. And that happens way before Election Day. So now we fast forward, Election Day's passed, and what the law says is, well, the apparent successful candidates get access to that, right? But the question being, what is an apparent successful candidate? Because in this case, obviously, it seems apparent, I think, to many of us, right, that President-elect Joe Biden is indeed president-elect. But there's also a lot of people who don't think that's apparent, or who aren't willing to say it's apparent because they're saying, right, there's lawsuits in place that have to finish out, or we'll wait until the Electoral College. So the purpose of this testimony was to identify, what does apparent successful candidates mean? And first and foremost, Lance, is, well, what's the purpose of the 1963 Presidential Act, right? And again, Mr. Light here testified before Congress that there are two purposes, one primary, one secondary. According to Section 1, the act was primarily designed to, quote, promote the orderly transfer of the executive power in connection with the expiration of the term of a president and the inauguration of a new president, end quote. The statute clearly warns that, quote, any disruption occasioned by the transfer of the executive power could produce results detrimental to the safety and well-being of the people of the United States and its people, end quote. So I think, Lance, right, it's pretty clear. The whole reason that Congress did this back in 1963 is they said, hey, we have to have a process here, right? It needs to be outlined how this is supposed to work.
As you were reading that, my eyes started to glaze over. And I've read it, but basically what they're saying is, like, you summed it up. There needs to be a process, and people need to understand. They say, well, this is a close election in 2020. Well, this law was put in place after the 1960 election, when the popular vote gap was 114,000, not millions, but 114,000 was the difference between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon in the 1960 election. So it was on the heels of one of the, I think, the closest election in American history that this came about. And they're saying, it doesn't matter how close it is or what you think happened. We need to get the wheels greased and get the transition process started. And I think that's important, is the historical significance of this, is that this wasn't when one side was in control or the other. This was just saying, here's what's best for the country. And I hope people listening today aren't turning us off saying, oh, you guys are for Biden, or, well, you're saying Trump. That we're not saying any of that. We're going over what is there and what should be done. Congress was absolutely clear in this law that it was not the President of the United States, nor the White House Chief of Staff, who would decide when and if to begin spending dollars and providing assistance under the 1963 Presidential Transition Act. Congress believed the decision was ministerial, not political in nature, and the GSA is in charge of this. Now, the problem is we have a leader of the GSA who appears that they do not want to make President Trump upset. But according to the law, this person is not beholden to any political group. And so here it is, stated in a bipartisan law written almost 60 years ago, saying that this is the person who has the responsibility and no one else.
For those listening out there, right, who are like, well, it's wrong that people are getting mad at the president. Well, in some ways, would it be nice for the president to concede? Yeah, if you want Biden to be the guy, but That's not required.
Right.
There's nothing legal about you don't have to concede. That's just a what do we call that? A formality, right? Just a tradition, so to speak, that has been developed. But you don't have to concede for anything to happen. And just to be clear, it's not President Trump's responsibility to initiate the transition. As we mentioned, right? Because Congress said this is a ministerial task, not a political one. That's why months before the election, right? All the way back, I believe it was in March, when this White House memo went out to all of their departments saying, now you must name people prior to the election. The whole reason that happens is so that it isn't a political process, right? So that it's ready, so that this stuff can take place. So if you want somebody to be frustrated at, right, it's not President Trump, it's the administrator of the General Services Administration. And by the way, that is Emily W. Murphy.
It goes on further. And, it says that these funds should not be denied to an unapparent victor, that they follow. They put it out there and said, we've had 3 close elections and this will not cause a problem. We need to do this. And they even mention, the election of 1800 and 1824 and 1876. If you're a historian, that those are, elections, 2 of which went to the House of Representatives, and the other one, a political deal was made between Northerners and Southerners during the Reconstruction period to pull the military out of the South so that white Southerners could start to do what they wanted to do without looking over their shoulders, which wasn't necessarily a good thing. But, this is something that's there to avoid what's going on right now. But you have to have people step up and do their job. And like you said, this falls on this lady's plate, and she's choosing not to do it.
And I think, Lance, the important thing here is the conclusion of the testimony, right? Is this gentleman basically explains that there are 2 conclusions that could have been reached. The administrator in the election of 2000 could have concluded that while close and contested, had still produced a presumed winner of the Electoral College. The second outcome being the administrator could have concluded that the election of 2000, while having produced a presumed winner, was either in the narrow class of 3 previous elections that allow doubt or constitutes a 4th election to be added to that class. So, in other words, he's saying there's basically 2 different scenarios that you could arrive at. And in this case, I think it's the same. The presumed winner, right? And that's where we get into, yes, is Biden the presumed winner? I think the answer there is yes. However, the second scenario says that even if there's a presumed winner, the administrator of the General Services Administration has the discretion to withhold that if there is doubt. We've got more to talk about though, Lance, right? We'll keep laying this out a little bit, but as we go, we're going to talk about, is this really how it should be? Because obviously leaving it up to somebody like this, right, has the possibility of producing this issue with transition. We've got more to talk about. So what should the transition be like? And we've still got to talk about this fact-checking business, right? Who fact-checks, and is that causing part of the problem that we're seeing right now? To find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Do we have a president-elect? Well, that's it's a tricky question depending on who you ask. Do we legally have a president-elect? No, we don't. And we never do until the Electoral College votes. And then, not even then, Lance, because in order for the person to become officially, legally the president-elect, the votes have to be read before a joint session of Congress by the vice president. That's the last step. And folks, that doesn't happen until January.
Once the new Congress is seated.
Exactly. And part of what's going on here, Lance, right, I think is this confusion about, we're so used to a relatively definitive result on election night that everybody kind of quits paying attention until the inauguration, right? But there is actually this long multi-stage process before we actually officially have a president and vice president-elect.
I think the results of this election so far are exactly the same as when President Trump defeated Hillary Clinton, at least in the Electoral College. The Electoral College votes are exactly the same. And I think that's what's causing a lot of, so is it a close election compared to what? You know, it's not as close. I mean, in the Electoral College, it's the same as it was 4 years ago. It's just a different victor. And I think that's what's got some people upset. But I would go as far as this. And even if you are a President Trump supporter, are you enjoying the way he's running the country since the election? I mean, we're in the middle of a pandemic. We have the economy take the stock market out of it, but you have people who are governors who are having to shut down their states to different levels, mayors who are having to do those kinds of things, which will affect economies and people's jobs and people's ability to pay their bills. And we're not having a president who is leading any kind of, coronavirus stimulus package or anything like that. We haven't seen or heard from our president pretty much since the election, other than on Twitter. So I'm just, as an American citizen, it's like, this is a time of crisis. We need a political leader. And it seems like since this election, it's not President-elect Biden, because there's some question as to whether or not he's the president-elect. And President Trump has basically gone missing in action, other than talking about fighting the election results on Twitter. And it's like, whoa, there's still stuff going on out there that we need leadership on.
And I think, Lance, a lot of what I've heard too, because I've heard some people say, the Trump campaign, right, is within its rights to do what it's doing, to challenge this stuff. And the answer to that is yes, yes, within your rights, right? Do we legally have a president-elect? No. But are we used to having again, here, the key, right, in the law, a presumed winner and a transition underway? Yes, we are used to that. And Congress clearly intended, via the 1963 Presidential Transition Act, for the transition to begin pretty close to immediately following Election Day, as soon as again, presumed winner is apparent. And I think, as we've talked about here, and as you mentioned, Lance, considering that the margin of victory is actually slightly larger, it's about the same in the Electoral College, but even a more sizable popular vote victory for Mr. Biden. I think that, we have a presumed winner. But again, there's a number of processes here that people, I think, are not familiar with, and that's part of what's causing consternation on both sides. There's the frustration, right, with it looks like, you've lost. Why are you being a sore loser? You should let this begin. And on the other side, I think there's the, never say die. There are these glimmers of hope, right? For example, something that people are, I think, not familiar with. We talked about the convening of the joint session on January 6th. Well, most people don't know this because we really, it almost never happens. During the joint session, any member can object to the returns from an individual state. So what happens here, Lance, is, right, the vice president stands up, is counting the votes and saying, Ohio, how do you cast your votes? And Ohio says, we cast our 18 electoral votes for Donald J. Trump. And Representative Lance Jackson stands up and says, I object, right? So what happens? Well, one member from the Senate and from the House of Representatives, it takes two to make an objection go through. Then, since there is a quote unquote valid objection, and they state their reasons why they object to that being cast that way, the houses adjourn, they debate for up to 2 hours in their respective chambers, and then they both vote on whether or not to accept the objection, in which case those votes can be thrown out or changed depending on what happens there. So even though, right, we think of the Electoral College as the definitive decider, right? I mean, we think about election night as the definitive decider, but obviously, for example, this year, that was not the case. So Electoral College is the definitive decider. Well, I mean, if you're really holding out hope, you could hold out hope for that joint session and for them to decide that the vote should be different. if there really is voter fraud, then Congress should do that, right? I mean, if all of this that we're being told and sold on is really happening and it's so rampant, I can't imagine that Congress is going to stand by, right, and just let this go through.
Do they play partisan politics, which is why the 2 runoff seats in the Senate in Georgia could be a determining factor? Because if they stay on party lines, then it would be a split vote. You would have the Democrats in the House saying, yes, we'll accept the results, and the Republican majority in the Senate saying, no, we don't.
In which case the objection fails.
Right.
It takes the consent of both houses. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
See, that's important for people to understand. But that can take place. So it's not done yet, folks. But it's not.
So should it be changed?
But it's not the end of the world. We do this every time. It just hasn't been brought to people's attention before. And like you said, legally they're within their rights, which is my point though of what I said earlier, which if you don't have anything to say about it, I understand. But this vacuum of leadership is what is really upsetting me.
I don't like it either.
That's what I don't like. That's what I'm trepidatious about. That's what, makes me shake and tremor all over.
Just because he's within his rights doesn't mean, for example, what's to harm by giving the transition assistance, and then let's just argue President Trump's side of things here, right? Let's say it all plays out and he's actually the winner. Okay, so we wasted a few tax dollars, letting Biden prepare for a transition, but isn't being prepared for the transition and being ready to start getting our money's worth out of whoever the new president is on January 20th, isn't that better to have wasted that money and to have been prepared than to hit day one and have a president who is not prepared to get to work for another 100 days? I mean, I guess to me, it seems like it shouldn't matter, right, who that person is. And we go back to the election of 2016, right? At the time, the Obama administration's administrator of the General Services Administration, I mean, it began, right? It was, even if something's going to happen, even if we don't like the result, it needs to take place because that person needs to be ready. In the event that everything proceeds, they need the time to be ready to start on day one so that we're not wasting time bringing a new president up to speed, because that's dangerous, folks. Okay, it doesn't matter whether you think Biden's going to do a good job or not, right? It's dangerous for a president to take office and have to spend weeks or months getting up to speed just on national security stuff. Because then if something happens right after the inauguration, right, you've got a president who's basically going in blind and who has no idea what's happening. And that's just, that's dangerous for all of us.
Isn't it better to have 2 administrations ready than nobody, right? I mean, that's the way I would sum up what you just said. So once Congress deems who has won in the Electoral College and we have the inauguration, isn't it better to have them both up and running and ready to go? And then whoever Congress figures out is the winner through the Electoral College is ready to go.
It's kind of that, it's a fail-safe thing. And again, it's something that I think regardless of party, because yes, this election is one thing, but it's also about future elections and the precedent, right? We set the norm and the mode of operation. And that's part of why Lance and I are still going to answer the question, should it be changed? Because we talked a lot about that in the opening, right? That ultimate question of, is it time to update this process? Because does this election highlight problems with the way that we go about this? Well, to find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Presidential Transition Act of 1963. Well, that's what governs exactly what we've been talking about today, the presidential transition, how it's supposed to proceed, the timeline of events, so on and so forth. Does it need changed?
Here's my take, okay? That one of the reasons why all the dates and timelines are set up the way they are is because of this and the 20th Amendment to the Constitution. So if you don't like all of this waiting, then let's change it to where things move more quickly on either side of the aisle, okay? No matter who you're supporting here. If you don't like it, then let's move it up. I really think that we can do it faster now, because the reason why it's set up the way it was is because, we had the telegraph, we didn't have radio, phone lines were just coming in, supposedly technology is better. We can do things faster and be more efficient. Why are we waiting from typically the first week of November until the third week of January? And I don't understand why we have to wait that long, because the bottom line is, folks, I don't like being on a ship and there's no captain steering the ship. Bottom line, here's my solution. Throw out the Electoral College, throw out it all, and just do it based on a national election, and do what we've been talking about for the last 3 or 4 months on this show. And that is, let's just have a nationwide election run by the federal government that's not administered by the states. And whoever gets the most votes wins, just like they do for dog catcher or garbage collector or any other local race. You have the votes, and whoever gets the most votes wins. And then there we go. We got our winner. And whether it's, class president in school or who gets to collect the milk money in kindergarten, you know who the winner is, and you just move on and let's get started. And if we get rid of the whole Electoral College process and just go to a national popular vote, then we don't have this problem. Simple solution there, bud. There you go. You say, I never make decisions. There's simple solution. That's all we've got to do. And all of this is a moot issue.
I was thinking about that. I think, it's something important to understand about what Lance is saying is if you were going to eliminate the Electoral College, it does require a constitutional amendment. And then once you did that, you could do one of two things. You could change either when the election is, right? So you could move it closer to the end of the year. So that there's not as long of a gap between that and the inauguration, or you change the term of president, and the term of president isn't 4 years, but it's, 3 years and 10 months or something. Whatever, or 3 years and 11 months, or, whatever you make it. The point is that, so we could change, we could probably change inauguration day, but without changing the Constitution, it would be hard to buy a new president more than an additional, maybe 15 days at best, because you got, New Year's and everything going on. So if you don't want to change the term of president, if you want to change the term of president, well, then, you could do that. To move it up. Past.
The 20th Amendment to the Constitution was a change to the Constitution. So it's not like, exactly. Oh, you can't touch the Constitution about this issue because we have to do what the founding fathers said. We've already done it once. So let's change it again. I mean,
the process we're using right now is different than what they used back when we started.
Yeah. So why is it hands off? Why is it so sacred that we can't change it? We changed it in 1933 with a constitutional amendment. Has life changed since 1933? Has technology changed? I mean, I think most people would say, well, yeah, duh. Well, then why not at least address this and have a discussion about it?
I guess my biggest point, my thing on this, Lance, and then we'll talk about the fact checking. Where I'm at on this is, I guess, I'm in favor of cleaning up, right, the qualifications of when transition begins, because I think that absolutely needs to be cleared up. As far as the timeline goes, I think it could be a little faster, but I'm not sure that we want something that's faster than, a month at a minimum, because it takes time, once you know that you're the victor, to get things in place to be ready to take over, to get up to speed. And I'm not sure that we want to, let's just say that we wanted to shorten it to a week. I'm not sure that that would be good. I'm not sure that that would benefit us in that, you've got 1 week to switch presidents and 1 week to get up to speed and be ready to take over the country. Now, obviously, the way it's working right now is we could be in a situation like that, right? I mean, theoretically, that can still happen if the transition doesn't kick in. But that's why I'd be in favor of, first and foremost, because it's a congressional act that cleans up the transition process. Let's get that cleaned up, because obviously we've discovered that there's an issue with it in that there's not a definitive, we have to, for example, putting in a deadline, 3 weeks after the election, that's the minimum cutoff for when that administrator of the General Services Administration must, decide who gets transition funding, or just eliminate that and say that's when transition funding kicks in for whoever the administrator of the General Services Administration says is the presumed, not the for sure, but the presumed winner, because that way it begins, like we talked about in the last segment. At the very least, you have somebody who's prepared. In the unlikely event that they don't become the winner, at least we were prepared. But I'm not sure that we can speed it up a ton without risking, putting somebody in place who's just not ready to come into office. And I know that changes from, administration to administration and who you're electing. But I think on the whole, because we don't want to isolate and look at a single picture and say, well, that's justification for doing it a certain way.
Well, typically less than half of the appointed jobs for an incoming administration are filled by January 20th anyway. So I guess I'm just going to argue with you on the basis of most of the time they're not ready by January 20th either, as far as having everybody in place and everybody.
We want less time?
Yeah. I mean, go ahead. I mean, let's obviously if
we want to come in with only 10% selected.
If we have a nation, well, we have that now. We have a president who keeps firing people and is not replacing them. So
yeah, well, that doesn't mean it's a good thing.
And they haven't been approved but it's happening under this system. So what's wrong with changing it? Is it going to be any worse? My point is it's not going to be any worse. And if people have voted for a change, even in 2016, if people voted for a change, why did President-elect Trump have to wait until January 20th? People wanted a change. The people voted. Their voice was, let's change it. Why are we waiting 10 weeks? We voted for a change. Let's do it. We want the change. Let's get it. So that's just the argument against. Again, I'm not saying I'm right, but there's my counter to you is they're not, quote, ready when they take over now. So again, prepare, get that all lined up before the election so that if you win, you can hit the ground running. Why make us as a nation continue to suffer? That's just my take on it. I know we need to move on, but that's just what I have to say about it.
I think there's a bigger conversation to be had maybe about the election process as a whole, because there is something to be said for if we didn't spend 2 years on a presidential or congressional election cycle, right? One, that would probably be better for the nation anyway, because some of this wouldn't be so drug out and long the way that it is right now. And two, maybe we could actually devote some time in that process to candidates being ready, prior to election day, saying, I'm assuming that I'm going to win. What do I need to do to be ready? At the same time, though, there's certain stuff that you just don't want to give to every candidate, because if we ever got past more than two, one, it gets expensive, and two, it gets cumbersome. You don't want to be briefing, 30 different candidates for president on super top secret classified information prior to an election because they might become the president of the United States. And then if they don't, they've gotten all this stuff that you wouldn't want most people to have access to, right? That you wouldn't give to just anybody. So I think there's, I guess my point here is there's a big picture to talk about, because we've talked about kind of one part of the election process. But if we're going to talk about that and talk about the Electoral College, as we have some, I think it's important that people think about, if we weren't working within this framework, how would we want it to work, right? How would we want this to be smoothed out, the whole process? Make it not so long, not so drug out. I think those are the fundamental questions that I come away with from this, because we can disagree on the particulars, but let's try to get the big picture right and then work to develop the particulars from there. And that kind of leads us, Lance, into this next and final item, right? The fact checking. So Facebook and Twitter have started marking or taking down posts that are deemed to be misleading in regards to the election, right? Or just flat out false. And they use independent fact checkers to do this. And now what's happening is some of these people that are spreading stuff about, the election was stolen from Donald Trump, they're getting their stuff flagged, and then they're just leaving the site because they don't like that their stuff is being flagged as misleading to others.
That's what happens when you have technology and social media, right? So what are we going to do about it? It's like, okay, we're going to hold it up and we're going to be the ones that fact check. Okay, well, I'll just go to a site that's not going to fact check me.
Or where they will give me different facts,
so
right?
Do you want freedom of speech, or do you want the government now to come into, I mean, you talk about opening up a Pandora's box and a show for a different day. What do you want to do then with these alternative social media sites that are willing to accept this differing of facts? Do they not have the right to exist?
I say two things on this. First, we've talked about this a little bit before. Should there be new legislation regarding, just generally speaking, social media? My answer is yes, but I think that in order to create that legislation, Congress first has to be reasonably informed, which I don't believe them to be. I have zero faith that they have any idea how to govern social media as it stands, which is why, as I've talked about before, I think there needs to be some form of a nonpartisan group assembled in government to get a handle on this, to provide insight to our elected officials so that they can reasonably make some decisions. But I think that's badly needed, regardless of this election, because it's arguably the largest and most valuable industry. And when you touch literally billions of people, not just in our country, but around the world, I think it's at the very least important that we get serious and examine this stuff. And to the second point, I think people have a right to leave the site. Absolutely. Do I think that that's good? No, because I think that True Chat, Lance, I think part of what we're trying to do here, right, is foster environments where you can civilly, and that's a key word, right, disagree with civility. And be able to have a conversation. And if we just run away and go to our own pigeonholes, and that's on the liberal and conservative side, because for what it's worth, I think the liberals tend to be worse about this in some cases than conservatives do about, well, I'm just going to cancel you if I don't like what you have to say. And I don't know. I don't think that's a way to run a nation.
No, I'm not sure that's any worse. I'm not sure it's any worse. That'd be my only thing I have to say that way as you're wrapping up your opinion.
Yes.
I don't think it's any worse. I think it's just as bad. I think anytime you close yourself off to the other side because you don't like the way they respond to you, then you're stopping the process of having a constructive conversation. And I think that's the key.
Better worded, and I agree. And that's kind of what we're about here at True Chat, right, Lance?
Exactly. We have this mission here at True Chat on all the shows on the medium to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And that's what we, again, tried to have today, is that we haven't taken one side or the other. And we, if you haven't picked up on it, don't necessarily agree on today's topics on what should be done. But we've had a respectful conversation. I've listened to Justin and he's listened to me, and we've made our points, and you, the audience, then get to listen to it. And you probably don't agree with either one of us in totality. You probably have a third option, which we always talk about on this show, that just because we say something, there's probably another option out there that might be even better. And what we hope to do is that you have those conversations with your coworkers and your family and your friends, and we all just begin to talk about these things and come up with some good solutions, better than what we currently have. And if they ask you, well, where do you listen to these guys? Well, tell them they're on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and everywhere podcasts are found.
The State of Us is released as a podcast Tuesdays and Thursdays by 4 a.m. in the Eastern Time Zone. We're also a syndicated radio program across the nation. Check your local talk market. See if they carry The State of Us. If they don't, tell them they should. For The State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to our recording producer, Devin McCain, editing producer, Bradley Butch, and thank you all for taking the time to tune in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.